All right, I just got the high sign. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming for our third 70th anniversary historical lectures. It's a great pleasure today to have Sig Hecker with us today. Sig began his career at Los Alamos as a graduate student and a postdoc. After a short stint at General Motors, he returned to the lab as a staff member in Chemistry and Materials Division. He moved on to serve as chairman for the Center for Materials Science, division leader for Materials Science and Technology Division. And what we're going to hear about today, for nearly 12 years, he served as laboratory director between 1986 and 1997. His tenure as fifth laboratory director coincided with the end of the Cold War, the rapid demise of the Soviet Union, and the unprecedented and turbulent geopolitical transition that followed. Many of us were here during that time, and we're going to hear about some of that today. He's presently the co-director for the Stanford University for International Security and Cooperation, a senior fellow of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He has had a distinguished scientific career. I won't go into all the details, but for his accomplishments, he's garnered many distinguished honors and awards, including the Department of Energy's E.O. Lawrence Award, the Enrico Fermi Award, and the Los Alamos Medal. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and a foreign member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And we're going to introduce Dr. Sig Hecker.
Thank you, David. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor for me to be here to participate in the 70th anniversary lecture series for the laboratory. It's an easy anniversary for me to remember because it turns out the lab is 6 months older than I am. Now, Alan Carr has already given you two beautiful historical lectures. Mine won't really be a historical lecture for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm not a historian. And second, I'm certainly not a dispassionate, independent observer. And so I will have to leave that to history and to people like Alan Carr. But what I thought I would do would to share with you found interesting and challenging. And it was a time of change and a time of challenge, as David just pointed out. And for those of you who were here, you'll relive some of those memories, I'm sure. For those of you who weren't here at the time, what I hope to do is to provide some background as to how the laboratory changed and why it changed, so that perhaps you can better understand the situation that the laboratory is in today. So what I've done then necessarily is just take a small slice out of those 12 years and try to focus on that. So here we go. I was appointed director in December of 1985, and I decided to take a month to sort of learn the ropes, although as David said, I'd been here before. Actually, he was kind enough not to say it, but I came in 1965 as a summer student. And in fact, Nina and I were here on our honeymoon in addition to getting introduced to the laboratory. I said I was going to take over the reins on January 15th, 1986. But before I could do so, I got this telephone call, and it said, "Hello, Siegfried, this is Edward. We need to talk." And what he wanted to talk about was the two things that I show here. Is President in 83 gave the Evil Empire speech at the 41st Annual Convention of National Association of Evangelists, of all places. And then he followed that with the Star Wars speech in March 23rd of 83. And Edwin wanted to make sure that this new director of Los Alamos is fully dedicated to understanding the threats of the Soviet Union and to be prepared for the Soviet Union. And Star Wars was the way to be prepared. So let me just try to introduce you to what my first year was like. I took over January 15th. This was just at a time when we were experiencing the so-called Gramm-Rudman-Hollings budget reductions, something similar to what you've seen in the past few months. So we've gone through this before. And in fact, here's President Reagan announcing that. So that's the first thing that faced me. Next thing, shortly thereafter, was the Challenger accident. And it was a stark reminder of the importance of everything that we do and the safety of everything that we do. Following that, about a month later, I had a visit as the new director from the local FBI. And it was about this gentleman by the name of Won-Ho Lee. And you can see the book here that was published some years later by Dan Stowe and Hoffman, of where they call him a convenience spy. Well, so they told me that we had a spy amongst our midst at Los Alamos, and I said, get him. And they said, no, we have to catch him in the act. So this lasted my entire directorship, almost 12 years worth. The Won-Ho Lee was sitting at the back of the situation. It turns out he may not have been a spy, and he certainly wasn't convenient, as this book indicated. And the one thing that is for sure, that during that entire time, he stole us clean, under the nose of the FBI. He took our secrets, he took them home. We don't know what he did with them after that. And so he did the laboratory an enormous disservice. It didn't all blow up until 1999, and at my colleague John Brown had to deal with that. Actually, it was one of the few times after I left the directorship that I had wished I was still director, because I knew everything, at least I thought so, about the Won-Ho Lee story. And shortly thereafter was Chernobyl, April 26th, 1986, where the reactor in what now is Ukraine blew up in an enormous fashion. It was actually Don Eilers, Jim Goforth, and a number of others at the atomic lake in Semipalatinsk, the old Soviet Union test site. Because what Reagan and Gorbachev did wind up doing is not getting rid of nuclear weapons, but at least say, look, let's concentrate on ratifying the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, which was initially signed in 1974, but was never ratified. And so they said, let's do a series of experiments, one in Nevada, one in Semipalatinsk, at that time Soviet Union, now in the country of Kazakhstan. And there's Don Eilers and company there. So that was an absolutely fascinating time, where the first time we got together, at least that we knew we got together with the Soviets. And I'll tell more of the Soviet story later, because it turns out in many ways they were just like us. In the middle, what you see is the Berlin Wall falling, and this is now in 1989. Shortly thereafter, the upper right, is Boris Yeltsin, when a few of the hardliners in the Kremlin deposed Gorbachev. Gorbachev was down in the Crimea on vacation. They took over, and Yeltsin essentially took back the reins, allowed Gorbachev to come. This was in August of 1999. Gorbachev came back, but he was finished. And on December 25th of 1991, he dissolved officially the Soviet Union into 15 separate states, of course, with Russia being the biggest one. That was followed in 1992, on September 23rd, with our last nuclear test, appropriately called Divider, in Nevada. And of course, at the time, it was President George H.W. Bush who was President of the United States, and he took a number of measures to sort of tone down both the rhetoric, confrontation between this new country of Russia, which at that time, as you might imagine, was in utter chaos, and the United States, in order to turn the temperature down and allow us to proceed. We went from there to the post-Cold War changes, And the people that you see up here, of course, President Clinton in the middle. This was Hazel O'Leary, who he appointed as the Secretary of Energy. Al Gore, his running mate, and then Vice President. Both of them quite anti-nuclear in terms of their overall sense and their beliefs. And then on the right-hand side, you have Secretary William J. Perry, who, by the way, is now my co-lecturer at Stanford and has been for the last 7.5 years, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General John Shalikashvili. And so the post-Cold War changes, in essence, we went through how do we get from them where we were confronting a Soviet Union to now dealing with this thing called Russia. And I will tell you a lot more about that. But what happened in rapid succession from the time that I showed you Semipalatinsk and then a similar test in Nevada, which was called the Joint Verification Experiments, to the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the Bush-Gorbachev first strategic arms reduction treaties, to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then to Clinton taking over and essentially formulating the post-Cold War arena. Initially, I should have said, President George H.W. Bush agreed to a nuclear testing moratorium on October 2nd of 1991. President Clinton and Secretary O'Leary continued that moratorium. For some time, we were considering 15 nuclear tests to sort of finish up our knowledge of what we need for nuclear tests and nuclear weapons into this world that we were going to get to, which was a world of no nuclear testing. It turns out both Clinton and O'Leary and Al Gore as well strongly opposed getting back to any nuclear testing. And indeed, we wound up with a comprehensive test ban treaty, which President Clinton is signing here. That turns out to be in 19. And indeed, that's how all of us felt being there with all of these changes occurring. So let me, essentially what I'm going to talk about today, this morning, and trying to take a capsule snapshot shot of my 12 years of directorship, at least the way that I look back at it, these are the events that shaped the time of my directorship. The end of the Cold War, without question, the biggest change of all, by the book that I'll talk a little bit about, and that is The Death of Commerce. And it was really the demise of this GOCO, government-owned, contractor-operated principle. That's what was put in place at the very beginning in April of 1943, and during my directorship, I essentially saw that disintegrate. And so the end of the Cold War did indeed affect everything that we did. Dealing with the battlefields deeply affected our relationship with the public. And then the death of common sense is this deterioration with the relationship with our customer, namely the US government. And just to go back to remind you how serious this stuff was, during the Cold War, here's Nikita Khrushchev in 1960. And if you look very carefully, this thing here is his shoe. Okay, that's Khrushchev's shoe. It was serious business. Khrushchev said, "We bury you." And he said that on a number of occasions. By the way, the reason he had the shoe there, his daughter explained many years later, those were brand new shoes. They were bothering him. He had taken them off underneath his seat. And then he had something that fell down. And as he went to pick that up, he instead picked up his shoe and pounded on the table. The other aspect of what happened during this time, that was 1960 at the United Nations. In 1961, in October, the Soviet Union came out of a testing moratorium with the United States. And October 30th, they tested the biggest bomb ever. And here's Yuri Trutnev, one of the co-designers with Andrei Sakharov, and me standing next to him in the museum in Sarov. the Russian Los Alamos. This was designed to be 100 plus megatons. Just think of that, megatons. Finally convinced them to explode it at half yield, at 50 megaton. And Yuri Trutnev explained to me, this was not a bomb to kill people, it was a bomb to make the Americans listen. But it certainly showed that the threat was such that these nuclear weapons during that entire time were first and foremost on our president's agenda, as well as the General Secretary of Russia. And then, of course, things got tight with the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. And indeed, as Michael Hobbs, a good friend, wrote just a few years ago, his book on 1 Minute to Midnight. I actually recommend that for very, very interesting reading as to how close we came to thermonuclear war when Nikita Khrushchev decided to move nuclear missiles, both short range and intermediate range, into essentially right under our noses. And this is President Kennedy's famous speech, where essentially he told them to turn around, and thank God they did. But here's just to give you an idea of what actually happened, during the Cold War. And this is just a number of strategic warheads. And for many, many years, all of this stuff was classified, so one uses the NRDC data, and they show how we had significant buildup in the United States, much faster than the Soviet Union, and how indeed the Soviet Union kept going until just about that time that I mentioned of Mikhail Gorbachev taking over. And you can see, whereas the total number of US warheads declined, it turns out we just made them better, we made them more accurate, they were more deadly. And the Russians built them more and more deadly. So during the Cold War, we were prepared to annihilate each other many times. By the way, all the rest of the countries, the big five, so to speak, they were all down noise. But these weapon systems were the strategic tools of the Cold War. And using that tool was the direct responsibility of the president. All the way from the beginning of Truman and Eisenhower, and then to the point where I came in, which was Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And so this was obviously serious business. And just to give you an idea of how serious this was, the way that we developed the nuclear weapons, we relied heavily, because we loved computers, but we relied heavily on nuclear underground, or actually first atmospheric testing, but then that stopped in 1961. And then the underground testing. And look at these numbers. I mean, these are huge numbers of tests. So in the 60s yet, when the Soviets actually broke out of the moratorium, we also followed, and there were 40 to 50 tests a year. Followed in the 70s, by 20, you could actually prepare things to do 40, 20, 10 nuclear tests a year, and we did indeed. And in looking back at those times, actually I recently had correspondence with my good friend Vic Reese, who I'll come back to later. He was Assistant Secretary of Defense Programs in the Department of Energy, and he recently requirements. That's the way it was during the Cold War. Who helped develop the stockpile stewardship was Vic Reese, who was Assistant Secretary for Defense Programs. And of course, the ones who supported it without question were our godfather, Senator Pete Domenici, and then also Senator Jeff Bingaman. So during that time of stewardship, it turns out, in the end, the test moratorium grew into a test ban. And those 15 tests that we once laid out to sort of get us ready for the test ban happened because both President Clinton and Hazel O'Leary essentially felt with 1,000 tests behind us, actually 1,030, we didn't need any more. And then we were faced with a comprehensive test ban, and then I was faced with the first annual certification letter that in an era of a comprehensive test ban, I had to write to the President of the United States that the nuclear stockpile that we developed is safe, secure, and reliable, and doesn't need testing, and I added at the end, at this time. And so we went from this sort of capability-based deterrent to stockpile stewardship. Vic Reese played an important role. And then various facilities that we developed to try to help us, in particular at Los Alamos, the DART facility at Livermore, NIF, and then better computational capabilities with the Advanced Strategic Computing Initiative. We looked at weapon life extension or remanufacturing, but while we were doing that, we saw the demise of the nuclear production complex, which made it very, very difficult. So stockpile stewardship in the end became our mission, and it was successful because of people like Vic Reese, Charlie Curtis in the Department of Energy, and our senators. So we tried to lay out to make this adjustment to the new world that we lived in, and some of you will remember this. He did a consent. So what we called our core mission was reducing the nuclear danger. What it meant is we have to do stockpile stewardship and management, we have to do non- and counter-proliferation, and we have to deal with the nuclear legacy of the things that were put out there in the DOE complex over those 6 decades. However, the only way that we felt that the laboratory could be healthy is it had to be surrounded by a scientific and technical capability, so that core technical competencies of the laboratory that is deeply based. And then when we have that, we should also be able to contribute to other pressing problems in the country, and at the same time have those other pressing problems and that technology come back and feed this center belt. And so that's what we used sort of to get us through the 1990s. And so we had civilian national missions, industrial partnership, and conventional defense programs as well. And this I've already shown you to give you an idea of how the laboratory has changed and grown. When Harold Agnew was director, took over, we were about 4,000 people, and this was one fine laboratory at the time. And then we grew, for reasons that I show you here. Of course, there was DOE Energy and Research, but there was the DOD, essentially the SDI spike, the cleanup spike, other DOE defense activities, particularly non-proliferation and so forth. So you can get an idea during my directorship from 85, through 97, 86 through 90, how the world changed pretty rapidly. But the biggest change, without question, was the collapse of the Soviet nuclear giant. And indeed, the best way to describe it is it went from privilege to poverty. Those people in their Los Alamos, their Livermore, their production complex did have lives of privilege in a society where it was tough to make a living. But then we were worried as they fell apart, what about the safety of the missiles, warheads, and bombs? What about loose nukes, materials? What about the technology exports? Will their people go to work for someone else? And then what about the infrastructure? All we knew is that it is enormously huge. And I show you, this is a picture I took of what used to be the Semipalatinsk test site, but now was an independent country of Kazakhstan. This now was an independent country of the Ukraine. Here's an icebreaker. We were indeed threatened at this time, 1992, more by Russia's weakness than by. And that was a very difficult thing to get through to the politicians in Washington, D.C. We worked on that very hard. The Soviet nuclear complex, I won't go through all this, just to give you an idea. I mean, it was huge. They built over 100,000 nuclear weapons. We had one Pantex to assemble. Okay, they had 3 nuclear weapons assembly plants. Actually, 4 serial production plants and 3 plants on the order of Iraqi flats. Huge intellectual assets, laboratories just like we did, and then dedicated institutes and universities in those towns. And altogether, there were about 1 million people that were employed in their defense and civilian, and there wasn't much separation between defense and civilian. So this is one thing the Soviet Union cared about, and they did it well. So with the JVE, the Joint Verifications and Experiments in 1988, and the follow-up negotiations in Geneva, we got to know the Soviets or the Russians. And so I kept on prodding our government to say, we ought to go over there. Those guys are ready to talk. They're ready to share, some of their issues and problems. But that didn't happen until a meeting in Leesburg, Virginia, in December 16th of 1991. Admiral Watkins at that time was the Secretary of Energy, and he came back from a meeting with George H.W. Bush, and George H.W. Bush said, the Soviet Union's coming apart, we ought to do something to make sure that the nuclear weapons stay safe. And so Watkins came right after the meeting with President Bush, and he put this on the table, and I said, I've been trying to get approval to go over there. And so Polly Galt, some of you knew her, his chief of staff, she said, I want you to go before Christmas. I said, I don't want to go that badly. I can wait until the winter is sort of over in Russia. But here we were in February of 1992. Here's a handshake with the Russian Hariton. There's John Shaner, for those of you who know John. And John Emily was with me. Chuck McDonald was there. And for Livermore, the director was John Knuckles. And here's Yuli Hariton, Vladimir Belugin, the director at that time. This is in Sarov, there, Los Alamos. They showed us facilities that our spy agencies must have spent billions and billions to try to find out. They opened it up because they wanted us to see how good they were. They finally had a chance on one. We started to build a relationship that was extremely important, and that then, in an incredibly fast manner, turned this thing from this completely adversarial relationship that our governments have to a friendship between these laboratories. And when we celebrated our 50th anniversary, so 20 years ago, in April of 1993, we invited the Russians, their two lab directors, at least the scientific lab directors. And here's one of them, Yevgeny Avrorin, at the lodge. You can probably tell from the background. And he presented me with a gift. And the gift was a piece of a dismantled SS-11 missile that used to be pointed at us. And it had this inscription that finally convinced me that the Cold War was over. It said, "From Russia with love." This was 1993. We still had our missiles pointed in that. You might recognize them again here. It took a little while for us to get past the scientific experiments we agreed to do together to really get down to those things that worried us, such as the security of their nuclear materials, of their nuclear weapons. And so we began, I was able to convince Charlie Curtis at Department of Energy at the time to go start up a joint program with the Russians to help them in this new world that they lived in as to how they can secure nuclear materials, what we call MPCNA, Materials Protection Control and Accounting. Here I'm signing a contract on behalf of the United States, but really as Los Alamos Laboratory Director at their Los Alamos with Vladimir Belugin. Here's Yevgeny Avrorin again. Actually, this is in the Radisson Hotel in Moscow, signing a similar document. And here's Kurchatov Institute, Nikolai Ponomaryov Stepnoy, also during that visit in 1994. So we began to work with them very closely. We worked with them very closely in scientific endeavors. And actually, I couldn't find it when I was finishing this up last night. The most important scientific collaboration were Irv Lindemuth, Bob Rainovsky, and his colleagues who worked on pulse power, because the Russians were absolutely the world's experts on pulse power. Okay, that collaboration since 1992, which is when it first started, has produced over 300 joint public and refereed journals. Absolutely amazing. This is joint Russian Los Alamos publications. I worked very closely with the Russian plutonium specialist, since that was my specialty, Lydia Timofeeva. And we actually wound up taking our Los Alamos science and having them translated into Russian. And here's Jim Taves at what we established as the Open Computing Center in Sarov, there, Los Alamos. So let me just wrap up. There's much more to tell on the Russian front, but let me wrap up that here we are 20 years later. I was convinced in 1992 that they were going to have some major, major problem in their nuclear complex on the basis of that enormous change. They had a system that was closed. Their second line of defense were the perimeters of their buildings, their perimeters of their cities. Their Los Alamos. Los Alamos was closed, as you know, until 1957. Their cities were still closed at that time. In fact, they're still closed today. But 20 years later, nothing really terrible has happened in the Russian nuclear complex. Of course, most of the credit goes to the Russians themselves. We were afraid that they were going to go someplace else, sell their wares in Iraq, Iran, and many other places, but they were patriotic and enormously resourceful under very difficult times. There were things like the nuclear suitcase, which holds all of the codes for launching the missiles, which was peacefully transferred from Yeltsin to Putin in 2000. And then here's just a quick summary. The missiles, warheads, and bombs that we were worried about, significant gains in their security. The loose nukes, lots of gains, but some serious risks remain. Nuclear technology exports, they did much better in not exporting than anything that we thought, but it's a continued concern. Infrastructure, some progress, it's still big. And then people and communities, they had an incredibly tough time in the 1990s. There were times when the people in Sarov, their Snezhinsk, their Livermore, did not get paid for 6 weeks at a time. They would just get credit at the local grocery store. And those people hung in there. They hung in there because they were patriotic, they did their job. It was just amazing. So the good news is nothing terrible has happened. The bad news is if you look at the relationship today, it's not good. We missed opportunities. We missed it partially on our end, they missed it on their end. And so this is a problem that continues to fester. Just to let you know, I've spent a lot of my post-director time on this. I've been to Russia now 46 times. I will be back there in June, working mostly these issues with my Russian colleagues. Okay, let me move on to the second and third topics, and the second one particularly. So what about dealing with the battlefields of the Cold War, the health, safety focus? And here's just a domestic timeline to give you an idea. These are the things that were important. Once upon a time, we were the AEC. There's still people I recognize out here who were here during the Atomic Energy Commission time. I was, since I came in '65. And then ERDA was created, Energy Research Development Administration. It had a very short life, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, because we were self-regulated. And then in '77, the creation of the Department of Energy. Along with that, one of the most devastating aspects for the laboratory was the dissolution of the Joint Committee of Atomic Energy. And that is, we had incredible support from Congress. And then eventually, in the 1990s, we became a political football. That really all came together with the One-Holy affair and the so-called Cox Report in 1999. And then in 70 to 72, the other things that had an effect, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, then the Clean Water Act and the RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Renewal Act. Then there was Judge Green decision of the breakup of AT&T. I wonder, what did that have to do? Well, it was the forerunner to the breakup of what we knew, as the AEC and what had become the DOE. Oak Ridge lost a very important lawsuit in 1984 about its reservation, that is the atomic reservation, and we lost essentially DOE self-regulation. Then came the Graham-Rudman-Hollings budget cuts, public revelations that I'll show you a little bit more about the DOE sites. Rocky Flats was raised, and those contractors that for years, the big American companies that had run the complex said goodbye. We're out of here because obviously this is not in our interest and the country doesn't seem to care. In 1991, the Tiger team showed up, and for those of you who were here, I'll tell you a little bit more. And so on down the line. And the Clinton White House, let me just say, with people like Al Gore, who was certainly not a pro-nuclear guy, and Hazel O'Leary, those were tough times. Time in our legislature became tough. We used to have more or less a free pass. That was over. And then Mr. Galvin reported on the DOE labs. So '88 was a particularly bad year for the Department of Energy. And that is Rocky Flats, Hanford, Savannah River. You can throw in Fernald. All these one by one, these facilities, the public got to look in and they didn't like what they saw. And as I said, Rocky Flats was raided. The Tiger teams were formed when Admiral Watkins took over in order to help clean up this mess we had in the DOE complex. Well, that tiger was waiting for us. He came out of the wild and attacked us. And I happened to be director at the time. So from September 23rd to November 8th, 1991, 7 weeks of assessment by the tigers. 3 volumes they wrote, 779 pages. There were 167 tigers. The lab after that was never quite the same. It was devastating in terms of the concerns that they pointed out in this new world that we lived in. I'll go on from that for now to the third and final part, and that is what I call the death of common sense, the demise of this very special management relationship. And the reason I call it the death of common sense, right around the time, 1994, as we were going through all of this, Philip K. Howard wrote this book, not just about the lab, actually mostly about America. And he said America is drowning in law, lawsuits, nearly endless red tape. Does that sound familiar? You know, before acting or making decisions, we often abandon our best instincts. That's what he said. So what happened, and these are just quotes from his book, is the government has deluded by thinking that the right decisions will be ensured if we build in enough procedural protection. In other words, get a big enough rule book. Again, does that sound familiar? The rule book is to prevent government officials, from exercising arbitrary authority. Instead, essentially, people exploit the loopholes that are unavoidable in the perfect rule book. But in modern law, the rule book is really unknowable. It encourages workers not to think and ties bosses down in nitpicking regulations. That's what we faced in the 1990s. As for the first, doors were blown open. We were exposed to the world at large, and this is what we had to deal with. But then in the end, the rule book can't provide the final wisdom. I mean, you still need judgment and balance, but you're fighting these other things that are constantly pushing at your door. So I knew Bob Galvin. I actually managed to help out to get Bob Galvin to chair this task force on alternative futures for the Department of Energy Laboratories. They reported in 1995. His bottom line was the system of governance is broken. And he said, actually, the labs didn't break it. He also said that it's the task force's position that the top-down command and control bureaucracies are counterproductive for these laboratories. Something really substantial has to be done soon or the vitality of the laboratories will founder. This was February of 1995, so if those of you who feel now that you're sinking, has gone on for some time. Now it turns out Secretary O'Leary, who was secretary at that time, she vowed to fix it. She concurs that the existing system of management of the laboratory is costly, bureaucratic, and inefficient. DOE orders are excessive, redundant, and vague. And so that's all correct. I agree with all of that. But unfortunately, we never really quite got to fix it. So my reaction was, the sense of partnership during this time got lost. We did this in partnership with the AC, initially with the Department of Energy. The focus was on regulatory compliance, on process, on paperwork, and not on outcome-driven. The trust that formed the very basis of the GoCo relationship was lost incrementally, not by design, but just over the years. And then the DOE's relationship with us changed from sort of owner-operator to policeman-operator. And so our world changed dramatically. So that's all about that, and in order to make sure that we have some time for questions, then let me actually just give a couple of final things. So I finished my directorship in November 2nd, 1997, and there was life after directorship, since I'm still standing up here now. And actually some of that life was really fun, because my own personal interests were plutonium metallurgy. And I just want you to look at this. This is a connected phase diagram of sides. And essentially, everything goes to hell at plutonium. So of all the things that they could have picked to build the bomb with, the plutonium by far was the most complicated. It's got 6 different solid phases at ambient pressure. And if you pressurize it, it has more. And in the dynamic conditions, it does all kinds of other things. But So for me, getting out of the directorship, which is a pretty hectic time, I could just say thank God for the complexities of plutonium. It gave me much to do following directorship. Then in addition, what kept me busy is sort of the global nuclear disorder. To some extent, that old Soviet-US time was, we knew how to deal with that. There were two blocks and everybody fell in one block or the other. And all of a sudden, it was very different. Of course, one goes back a long way, and that's Israel and what they did in the 1950s or early 60s. But then you just go across, this Kim Jong-il in Korea, the Ayatollah in Iran, A.Q. Khan, the peddler in Pakistan. There was South Africa deciding to help itself in the 70s and early 80s and built 5 bombs. There was Bashar al-Assad in Syria, who the best that we know is he had a plutonium production reactor being built. The Israelis finally wiped it out in 2000. I'm not sure exactly what he's going to do with it. India and Pakistan declared themselves to be nuclear powers. And Saddam Hussein was playing with the nuclear weapons for a long time, trying to get them, but instead it sort of got him, as you can tell. And then Gaddafi, same thing, decade and a half, trying to get nuclear weapons. And then he actually gave it up voluntarily. So that certainly kept me busy. In addition, I've spent a lot of time in North Korea, and here I actually am trying to assess the North Korean nuclear program. They allowed me to come in, obviously for a reason, to tell the world what they were capable of doing. So there was actually life after directorship, and I personally have had a great time being able to find ways that we can actually try to make the nuclear order be one that the world can live with. Let me just quote you from a comment from Vic Reese, who looked at all of this, standing back, first in DOE, in defense programs, and now in DOEs, in the Secretary's offices. At the end of the Cold War, primary responsibility for nuclear weapons program shifted from the president to the DOD. That was a big, big change. And it was downgraded in importance. And that's what we had to learn to live with, and we must live with today. It's different than it was when I first started as director. At that time, there was nothing more important than nuclear weapons. Now it's downgraded. From the focus on scientific excellence, he says, to now the focus is on good enough for life extension programs. Now the DOE labs relationship became characterized by competitive, profit-making suppliers, adversarial contractual relationships rather than working partners who share the same long-term goals and work for the same bosses. And so the situation we find ourselves in now, it's not our fault, it's kind of not the government's fault, it's just, it happened that way. The world changed on us, and so the challenge today is really how do you live in this world. So let me conclude by saying that I've personally had a great time at Los Alamos, and here I'm skiing the powder somewhere up in Canada. And then a lot of the labs, we flew high. It was fantastic. It were great times. And that's sort of captured here. By the way, those are Bucky Kashawa's Volant skis that I have on. And so it was fun. There were lots of times like that were enthusiastic, that were terrific. But there were also the others where I crashed. Fortunately, I couldn't find a photo of my crashing, so you'll just believe me that I did crash. But then, sort of looking back at the directorship, it is a lot like skiing. That while you're doing it, it feels so good. It's so exciting. But it really feels good when you take off those ski boots. And that's the way directorship felt. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. But I really enjoy life now as well. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
And thank you for leaving us a few minutes for questions. We are videotaping, so we have some microphones, and we have for questions. We'll start right here with Buck.
So here you were in 1985, head of the Center for Material Science, fairly young, minding your own business, more or less, doing a lot of skiing, and then you woke up one morning to find yourself the director of the lab. How did that happen?
Yeah, it wasn't my fault. As you said, I was minding my own business. I had run on Kerr, the director, decided after 5 years or so that he would go back to Washington. And so they were looking for a director, and so the UC search committee came around and asked a number of people, so what do you think we ought to do? So since as you well know, I typically prepare well, when I've got something to do. So I prepared my whole story as to what the laboratory should be doing in the future. So I put that together, met with Bill Fraser, who was leading the charge, as vice president at California, and this was in the September timeframe. And so I told him what ought to be done with the laboratory. And it was important to me because I did want to stay in Los Alamos. And I thought the last thing I wanted was some guy to take over who's going to take it in the wrong direction. So I sort of said, this is what you ought to do. And then lo and behold, just before Thanksgiving, I got this call from Bill Fraser saying, hey, how would you like to consider the directorship? And I said, I don't meet my own qualifications, no thank you. And because, I was just a scientist type. I mean, I've been to Washington a few times for science, not for politics. And so I said, I don't meet my own criteria for the directorship. I gave you these pages, I don't meet them. Well, lo and behold, in the end, I wound up going out to interview. And I called Nina, I remember that evening, and I said, hey, because she wasn't crazy about this at all. And so I said, honey, don't worry about it. I just flunked, the interview. She said, well, that's good. So a week later, I got a call and said, how would you like to be director? I said, my God, you couldn't find anybody, more qualified than that. So in essence, that's how it happened. But I also had good advice. One of my friends from Ohio State said, before you go out for the interview, because I was very skeptical, I said, if they can't find anybody better than me, this laboratory is really in trouble, better prepared at least than I am. And so he said, well, if that's the way you feel, don't go. If you go for the interview, at least say that you'd like the job. So I went, I got the job, and I look back at the 12 years, and of course, there were great times, there were tough times, but I would certainly do it over again, but I'm really glad I don't have to.
Other questions? Yeah, Amit. And then we have another one over here.
So you talk about the death of common sense. Here. You talk about the death of common sense. You hope for rebirth of common sense, or is it permanent?
I'm sorry, could you help me?
Yeah, he wants to know if there's any hope for the rebirth of common sense.
Oh. So actually, Philip K. Howard has written 2 additional books, so we need to read those books, to help us. It's very difficult. I mean, the American political system has really gone in the other direction. Even in those times when the Cold War was ending, and you could see people thinking differently, Al Gore, Hazel O'Leary, compared to some of the others, they were still holding together for issue of nuclear security. That got blown off with the Cox Report in 1999, the divisiveness, and that's only gotten worse since that time. And so I'm afraid our politicians, seem to be willing to sacrifice the real good of the country. And all you have to do is watch through the last few elections, to see that bitter divisiveness. And so it's going to be really tough. The only good news is there are actually several moves in Congress where people have tried to introduce legislation to say, look, this is really important, this is really serious, and we ought to go back to where we're unified. But nevertheless, it's going to be difficult. There'll be a great challenge for the next Secretary of Energy to reestablish the fact that, in the end, we're here to serve the country. Of course, part of what will have to be done, we will have to augment our mission. I mean, our mission has changed, just like Vic Reese, This is a different world. It's not the most important thing on the president's desk anymore. Yes, it's important. It's shifted over more to the Pentagon. You have to deal with it differently. But this laboratory over the years has established and developed such incredible technical, scientific and technical capabilities that the issue is how can we find the appropriate way to have that help the country and not be mired down. We've got these racehorses and we put weights on the legs. And so somebody has to come to their senses to say, we have to help to find the right mission, and then we got to let them go do it. Carol.
Okay, we'll do this one, and then we'll let Carol have the last word.
Okay, so you interact with people at the policy level now and various countries that are involved. Do you know what level of confidence they have in the their stockpile, Russians, ourselves, with regard to a lack of testing, whether they have continued confidence in the stockpiles?
Yeah, so the question is, both ourselves and the other countries, the nuclear weapons countries, what confidence do they have in their stockpile without testing? In our country, at least what's proclaimed at the government level is more confidence than I have. And so I think this is something that currently needs attention. At this point, and I'm actually going to issue a report in the next couple of months, because I've been working on this for several years out at Stanford, I'm still very much in favor of keeping the comprehensive test ban. Because in the end, the other countries could benefit much more from going back to testing than we could benefit. And we have ways that we can actually make up, for the lack of testing, but we're not necessarily doing the best way possible. But nevertheless, we have a chance, but it is a very difficult job to do. The Russians, they still do things that are closer to testing than I think that what we do. Their systems tended to be more robust to begin with. But actually, I think if they'd have to make the choice today, they might not sign a comprehensive test ban treaty. But they have signed it. The other country from there, it drops off significantly. The Chinese have only done, 45 tests. And then, of course, the Brits have worked with us. The French have worked independently, but we keep in close touch. Then when you get to the other outliers, both Pakistan and India have now done 6 each. That's not much upon which to base your arsenals. And that place, Southeast Asia, I think is the most dangerous place in the world today. And so I think they would love to get back to testing, and that's one of the reasons why we should not, is in order to make you stick with the fact that today you really don't want to go back to nuclear testing.
All right, we'll have one last question here, Carol.
I was struck by your comment about the crumbling of the relationship with the U.S. government. How we used to be in the position of owner and operator, and now we're policeman and operator. That there's this loss of a trusted relationship where we're the scientific advisors in some sense. Has anybody filled that vacuum? Does that relationship exist with the government and other providers with whom we could work, for instance?
Yeah, certainly during my tenure as director, I saw that relationship, change dramatically. In that we really had an extremely close relationship. I just remember when I came as director, for example, Albuquerque, which had the DOE office in Albuquerque, had responsibility for the production complex. We worked closely together, absolutely closely together, supporting each other. It was a terrific relationship. And then you could just see with the end of the Cold War that started to break up. And then particularly as Congress got into the act. My own personal view is that Congress and congressional staff like to meddle. They don't like to give blanket authority to anyone. Well, the nuclear weapons program had blanket authority. We had enormous authority and abilities. And once the Cold War was over, we started just losing that bit by bit by bit. And while I was director, I felt it, piece by piece it would go. And I would go to Washington and I would try to protest. And then each time I went, I came back with a little bit less. For example, the LDRD, laboratory-directed R&D. We used to be able to spend that in any way that we felt was important. That was the idea, laboratory-directed. Once the Cold War was over, they put more and more restrictions on each of those and made it more difficult, for the laboratory to really look out for its future. So we lost that relationship. I don't quite know how we can get it back, especially with the fact that the nuclear weapons are not up there anymore as the single most important thing on the president's desk. As long as we had that, we had enormous backing, we had enormous coverage. So now the challenge will be, how do you formulate together with the appropriate government arms a mission that is so compelling? I mean, after all, as you saw from the growth chart of the laboratory, this place is huge. And that was just the lab employees. Altogether, we have 10,000, some bodies working at the laboratory. That's a huge number of people in today's environment. You have to have a compelling reason and mission for those laboratories to exist, to have that many people, and then you have to have a sufficiently compelling mission to back the government off, from the constant meddling and from the constant interference. So, the old days of what we called the GOCO, government-owned contract operated, they told us what they wanted, and we could decide what to do and how to do it. That changed during my tenure. I saw it go down the drain. I tried to fight it as much as possible, but in the end, you just kept losing. So I see a few signs of that in Congress today, standing up and saying, look, we really need to make sure that our nuclear weapons complex is really up to snuff. But it's going to be a tough fight. I wish I could be more optimistic, but it's a real challenge for laboratory management and for laboratory staff.
All right. I have just one quick announcement while I have you all here. This National Security Education Lecture Series continues next month with Joe Palat talking about Operation Today. And since he's here, our May speaker, Brian Boyer, is going to talk about international safeguards. So let's thank Dr. Hecker one more time for his presentation.
I did have this, just in case you didn't have, I had backup questions, but you were spared, so thank you.